Our learning objectives for North America, similar to the other ones. So of course, looking at the geographic features, but then focusing more on the industrialization and how it has impacted the geography, but also the environments, looking at patterns of industrialization, and then also inequality that has occurred and is occurring in the United States. So kind of the focus here is looking at that industrialization process. So North America, of course, this is just including the United States and Canada. We'll talk about Mexico whenever we get to Middle America, is where that is located. So we're mainly just looking at the US and Canada. So if we look at the climate, of course, this is the region we're most familiar with since it's where we're at. But the climate here, again, is colder as you move from south to the north, of course, as we get closer to the North Pole and the Arctic Circle. So, of course, the northern part of Canada, very cold like we had seen with Russia, except, of course, in the lower, like in the south, of course, the higher elevations are still colder as well. It's also wetter as you move from west to east. So the East Coast and more middle area being wetter than the West Coast. Again, the exceptions here are the Northwest Coast and the West Coast of Canada. So along the coastlines, those are going to be wetter as that water evaporates off of the oceans and leads to rainfall. But if we compare, and once we get off the coast, if we compare the regions on the left or in the west compared to those in the east, the eastern part is going to be much wetter, receive more rainfall than what we see in the other areas. So again, we can see this on our map here, looking at the rainfall. Again, typically going to be drier on the western side, wetter on the eastern side. Now, if we kind of look at these physiogeographic provinces, so just what these terms mean. So there's physiogeography, which is that physical geography, just kind of where things are. But then we also have provinces. So these are regions that have similar geology and topography. So we can see a few of them here. So of course we have the Arctic. That's one of the physiogeographic provinces. Again, it's all very cold, lots of kind of tundra, that permafrost. Then we have the Canadian Shield here that kind of is shielded and helps provides that kind of protective layer of that cold weather to the lower part south of that Canadian Shield. And then more within the U.S., we have a few different provinces. Of course, the Great Plains, where we have a lot of fertile soil and agriculture, the Appalachian highlands, our coastal plains down here, of course, the Rocky Mountains on the west side, and then the western Cordillera. So again, we have a few different types of climates in regions based on that geology as far as mountainous versus more plains. We look at differences in soil. Of course, agriculture most prevalent in those Great Plains. Also kind of taking a minute here to talk about come back to those tectonic plates. So for the most part, North America, because it does not reside along a plate, is relatively calm. So most of North America is within one of the tectonic plates. So not a lot of geological activity there, because again, it's away from those plate boundaries. But of course, along the Pacific, along the West Coast, where it's on that border in that Juan de Fuca plate, that's where more of the geological activity, so hurricanes, volcanoes, that type of thing, are more prevalent. So again, we think about this Juan de Fuca plate. It is subducting under the North American plate. Again, subduction just means the two come together and one goes underneath the other. And this is where we get a lot of geological activity. So for example, Mount St. Helens, which just erupted in the 1980s. Again, we have a lot of earthquakes, volcanoes and that type of thing more in the California, Washington area. Then also we have the San Andreas Fault. So that is kind of marks the boundary between the North America plate and the Pacific plates. And this is where we get lots and lots of earthquakes that occur, especially in the California area. Now if we kind of switch into the history and the human geography. Of course, the Native Americans, and there's a video in our map here that kind of shows the different tribes of those Native Americans and where they resided. So it's estimated that about 3 to 7 million people lived in North America in 1492, and this is kind of when this picture is estimated from. Again, lots of different tribes, so they all had a hunter-gatherer and agriculture, so they traded for goods or for resources with other tribes. Some got along, of course, others did not, and there was a lot of kind of infighting or fighting between tribes. But again, kind of just living off the land, moving as they needed to go to different resources. In some of the areas, though, 90% of that tribal population died, mainly due to disease that was brought about by the Europeans. Of course, murder with the various wars as the lands were being taken over and the Native Americans were being pushed out of their land, and that relocation, again, whenever they were unsuccessful at fighting off the conquerors and the Europeans. So this colonialization, so again, this is one of the other themes we'd mentioned. So at some point or another, the European countries had essentially had control or heavily influenced almost all parts of the world. And of course, North America is not an exception to that. So the colonialization, so this included multiple countries, so Spain, France, and Great Britain controlled most of the areas by 1750, so about 300 years there from where the tribes and the Native Americans were separated by tribes until now, again, those European countries taking over. So the spatial patterns are partially driven by economic and religious goals. So we can see, again, the graph here. So Spain was more kind of into Mexico, and kind of like Texas and Arizona, also in Florida, so kind of coming up from the south. France more kind of came in from Canada and the Hudson Bay, as well as some of the islands, so Newfoundland over here, Great Britain along the eastern coast, and then France kind of more in the middle America and up into Canada. So the reason for kind of the separation is that France was most concerned about the fur trade, or that's where their economy came from. So if we think about the area, again, lots of forests, lots of animals in that region that France controlled. Spain was more about the mineral extraction, so different, think about diamonds and coal and other mineral resources, but also religious, so they were spreading Catholicism. So again, coming up from Mexico and more into North America. And then Great Britain more along the East Coast. This was commerce, so of course cotton, tobacco, and agriculture is what they were kind of feeding on and why they wanted control of these areas. Unfortunately, one of the huge impacts of that colonization was slavery. So this was the engine that allowed that colonial and early U.S. economies to occur. So the link between the North and South economies. So for example, the cotton was grown and picked by slaves in the South. And then in the North, those manufacturers, so the textile mills and factories that used the cotton to produce goods for the North. So there was a huge connection between those. So while there were not a lot of as many slaves in the northern states, they were still supporting slavery by using that cotton that was mainly produced and able to be grown with the use of slaves. So the banks actually loaned slave owners money to purchase more of them with international connections, of course Africa, but other nations as well. So this industrialization that occurred, and it kind of happened at different regions at different times. So kind of Sweden and the UK is where it kind of started from, so early in the 1800s. And then the US was behind the UK again as they came and this was during that colonization as they were coming more into North America, then that brought that industrialization with them. Again, Russia a little bit after North America, a little bit later. Again, they needed money to support and to buy that equipment. Again, they weren't very efficient at that, so they never quite reached the production levels that the UK and the US did. And then again, Japan a little behind them. We'll come back to those. And then last to kind of join in was China, but unlike Japan and Russia, they were able to heavily benefit and increase their economy from that industrialization. So this started, of course, with the steam engine that fueled the industrialization after the Civil War. The regions had industrial specialization. So, for example, iron deposits. So we think about Pittsburgh, kind of the Steelers, because of that huge amount of steel that was being produced because of those iron deposits so close by. There was that shift to the rural and urban populations. So in 1790, about 95% of those in the U.S. lived in rural areas. By 1920, more than half lived in cities, and today more than 80%. So again, that industrialization, moving more to factory and business type of economy, less away from rural. And not that rural isn't important. Again, that hinterland supports it. It provides the food. But because it's so much more efficient, the manpower isn't as needed because of better industrialization, better tractors, better farm equipment that has decreased the number of individuals needed to produce those crops. Again, using Pittsburgh here as an example. So in 1800, Pittsburgh's population was about 1,500. It is ideally located to a lot of natural resources. So coal is close by. Lots of forest for lumber, but minerals, so again, steel and iron. Also natural gas and petroleum were all there as well. So it was an ideal location for shipping. So as soon as 3 rivers, so there are 3 rivers that combine right at Pittsburgh, so that allows for that transportation to occur. But also lots of trains moved through this region as well. So they had great shipping, kind of a great shipping center. So then by 1860, Pittsburgh and the surrounding regions, there were about 900 different factories that were there, and the population of about 50,000 from 1565. So a huge increase. So from 1,500 to 50,000. So a huge increase in their population. So again, those workers moved from the rural areas to work in the factories of Pittsburgh. So of course it became known as the Steel City. It's where Steelers come from because they were able to utilize those natural resources. They didn't have to ship it as far because everything was right there. New inventions for better and more efficiently using that steel and harvesting the iron. And again, all that transportation, either by rail or by river, was very beneficial. So by the 1990s, Pittsburgh is kind of an industrial powerhouse. It made about 25 to 50% of all steel for the U.S. By the 30s, the population had increased again, now up to 700,000. So again, remember, it was only about 1,500, so less than 2,000 just 100 years before that. So now what we see is actually what's referred to as deindustrialization. So again, kind of the peak of their population around 1930. However, that has started to decline now. So as the steel workers started losing their job, that population went down to about 150,000 by the 1980s. So again, industrialization brought huge economy, lots of people to the area. But then due to shifting of the economy, shifting of resources, we talk about globalization. So now steel is more imported from places where the labor is less, so it's cheaper to import it than to make it in the U.S. So that demand has went down. So that has led to a loss of economy, or this deindustrialization in the area. So the population has continued to decline though since the 50s, where it was kind of at its peak. So this deindustrialization has led to what is referred to as urban sprawl. So that industrialization shifts the populations from the rural to the urban areas. So again, lots of people move to Pittsburgh trying to get jobs in those factories and away from rural communities. So the deindustrialization, so as those factories start shutting down, now it decreases the importance for living in the city centers. So now people want more space and housing. So now they're starting to move away from the cities, more in kind of the suburb areas due to that deindustrialization. And that's what leads to what's referred to as urban sprawl. So the expansion of settlements away from the central cities, again, suburbs, best example of this, into those low density but more car dependent communities. So now they're traveling into the city if they need to, but again, spreading out, having some space in between, less apartments, more houses, that type of idea. Just using an example here of how this is affecting farmland. So for example, in Berkeley County, West Virginia, which is close to Martinsburg, if you're familiar with that area. So in 1997, just kind of an aerial view, lots of farmland here. There were definitely, some towns, houses, and that type of thing. However, now in 2020, that farmland has now been turned into housing. So again, this idea of urban sprawl, so everyone was in the city, now we're kind of moving back to rural areas, but that's now taking away from that farmland and agricultural use. So this image is just kind of showing that conversion of agriculture land into urban and low density residential, so again, kind of suburbs is what we're referring to there, from 1992 to about 2012. And of course, it's continued since then, but especially along the East Coast, you can see how much more of the farmland is being turned into housing developments. And of course, also being seen on the West Coast, not so much yet in the middle America, but we are starting to see that as well, as some of these cities are growing and moving more into that rural, those rural areas. So just kind of an example here of how this kind of impacts. So again, our urban center, so this would be like our city, the center of our city. So the idea here of gentrification, so another term for this section. So this is the process whereby the character of a poor urban area is changed by wealthier people moving into it that improves the houses and attracts new businesses. So again, this is the idea of gentrification. So a poor area, wealthier people move into it, and that drives everything up. So this typically displaces the current inhabitants because they can't afford the housing and the different businesses that are in there. So let's just design a little town here. So we have a nice downtown area. We have businesses and shops, apartments. So again, here in our little urban center. So everything the resident needs is in this center. All right, so now the town's doing well. High rises start to be built. The tech company moves in. So again, lots of people coming in. So the downtown is bustling. Real estate prices go up. So now people are like, I can't really afford to live here anymore. So they start moving out to the surrounding areas. So we start to see these kind of rural areas start increasing. So as people move out of that urban center because they can't afford the real estate anymore, now they start creating new communities. So they have the resources to do so because, again, they've had these good paying jobs. They just don't want to pay the high prices. So they have transportation, they have money to buy and build because these are lower economy. The house cost of living is low, so they can build much nicer homes in these rural areas than what they could have in the urban center. So this is where that urban sprawl begins. So now fewer workers, though, have jobs that require commuting. So especially after COVID, there are more and more people who are working from home, have virtual jobs, or just are required to go less into the office. So again, that deindustrialization as we move away from all that factory work to more efficient, more tech kind of remote jobs. So now new businesses build up in the suburbs. So they're attracting more and more people. So now we start to get these communities in these suburbs known as an edge city, because they have their own resources, they have their own supermarkets, they kind of have everything they need in this one little community. So now, as more and more businesses and people, again, usually higher, middle or upper class, that left the urban areas. So now here in the urban area, the housing market starts to plummet, because now all the people who can afford the higher costs, they have moved out to these edge cities. So now the cost of living starts going down in that urban center and up in the edge city. So those who left, now the housing value goes down, there's lower rents, and less maintenance of the existing buildings. So the cities kind of start crumbling. So some of those suburbanites, those people who live in the edge city, they decide to move back now to the urban city, because now the housing market just went up in the edge city. So now they don't want to pay those prices. So they move back to the urban centers. They buy the older, cheaper housings, they renovate it. But now that increases the housing value back in the downtown. So we're seeing this kind of cycle. Again, the city's healthy, economy's good. Now it's kind of costs too much, so people move out, set up these edge cities. Now that's too expensive. So now they go back to the urban center where the housing market is plummeted. But now the individuals who are in that urban center can't afford to live there anymore. So that increasing housing cost, again, those rents are now unaffordable for those lower income workers who were living there to begin with. So this is including workers who might have lived in these downtown areas for years or even decades. So this increased property value displaces those lower income families and small businesses. Again, that gentrification starts to happen. So it can change the racial and ethnic composition of the neighborhoods within those cities, because again, now you have this mix of lower income and higher income individuals. Again, those who have lived there forever feel infringed upon. And so again, we start to see some different kind of conflicts occurring. All right, and this leads to kind of this geography of poverty within the U.S. So these regional differences where we have a higher poverty in the South related to kind of that history of development. Of course, the Civil, even back to the Civil War. So Canada has a lower poverty rate actually than the U.S., but both of them have a lot of income inequality that's correlated to that ethnicity and race. And this finally culminates here on what's referred to as redlining and some of the environmental conditions. So after the Great Depression, federal programs were developed to help support home ownership. So these homeowner loan corporations were kind of given a grade, so A, B, C, and D in neighborhoods that reflect their mortgage security. So unfortunately, this lettering set up discriminatory practices that was used by that HOLC agents to assign lower grades to communities with non-white and lower income neighborhoods. So this redlining has now increased and has kind of been impacted by pollution. So the air pollution exposure associated with these different regions from the 1930s to 2010 are shown over to the right. So these areas have the highest concentration of nitric oxides, which becomes localized and from high temperature combustion. So again, those factories releasing that, and those concentrations contribute to airway inflammation, coughing, asthma attacks in these regions that are much more prone to this kind of toxic waste. So that air pollution disparities have been decreasing though in